Welcome to Pleasureology Island. I'm Freethought Steve, the lone pleasureologist. Welcome to another meeting of the Freethought Pleasureology Project, also known as Pioneers of Pleasureology, Pleasureology Overachievers Club, and of course, the League of Extraordinary Pleasureologists. I want to review for you what it is that I'm trying to do here as I describe to you my own personal sexual history as accurately, as scientifically, as completely honestly as I possibly can. The reason I'm doing this, it's part of the whole Pleasureology project, because the Pleasureology project is first learning how to calm down emotionally, learning how to relax our body, all our muscles from head to toe, and learning how to stabilize our consciousness, clarify our consciousness so that it's not filled with too many junk thoughts, learning how to stabilize our attention so that we have a stable and relatively thought-free field of consciousness, a globe of consciousness that our brain is creating. And we're learning how to operate our brain in a calmer and more organized way so that we have a calmer and more organized consciousness. And then we're using that calm, organized, and expanded consciousness, because our consciousness expands down into our body as we learn how to relax our body. Our consciousness expands out when we learn how to reduce our thoughts. Our consciousness becomes clearer and more expansive, and we can see what's outside of us. And we learn how to pay attention to our sensations, including our physical sensations, as vividly as possible. Paying attention to those sensations vividly and being aware of them, particularly our body sensations, particularly during sexuality. Because once we have managed to create a relaxed body, a calm emotional brain, and a stabilized, clarified consciousness, then we can use this whole pleasure-generating system to generate super euphoric states of sexual pleasure. And that's sort of the second level of happiness that we achieve in pleasureology. That is our goal. And we want to learn how to fill our consciousness with a cloud of pre-orgasmic sexual bliss by combining strong emotional arousal, strong emotional sexual arousal, with pleasurable sensations from our body, particularly our sex organs. Combining the pleasure of physical sexual sensations with emotional arousal, because we are either thinking of or actually experiencing or fantasizing about some really sexy situation that acts as a sexually arousing stimulus, which, when it is perceived by our emotional brain, our emotional brain's sexiness recognition centers recognize the situation that we are imagining or actually experiencing or watching in some kind of erotic entertainment of some sort. Our emotional brain's sexiness recognition centers says, yeah, that matches the innate criteria for a sexy situation, those criteria were genetically built into our emotional brain, and we inherited that as part of our sexiness recognition centers, exactly what kind of person, what kind of sexual activity our emotional brain will find sexually arousing. When the sexiness recognition center recognizes our current situation, real or imagined, as a sexy situation, then that sexiness recognition center tells the emotional brain to turn on our sexual arousal circuits. And the sexual arousal circuits are the output from our emotional brain. The sexy situation is the input to the emotional brain, which the sexiness recognition centers say that matches my criteria for being a sexy situation. And that causes the emotional brain to send nerve impulses, a surge of emotional energy out through the nerve circuits. And this is output from the emotional brain that goes into our body to create sexual arousal in our sex organs. And it goes into our consciousness to give us a feeling of euphoria, the feeling of being sexually turned on, which is an arousing, or rather a euphoric experience. The feeling of being aroused is a euphoric and enjoyable experience in and of itself. But then also, the emotional brain gives us like an urge, gives us urges to do certain things sexually that will increase our pleasure. And this is what Freud called the primary process. This is the process by which our emotional brain tells us what we need to do in order to satisfy the particular need that is most active in our emotional brain at the moment. If we are out on a hike, we've been hiking up in the mountains all day, and we've eaten all the snacks we brought with us, and we're heading back down the mountain, and it's a long way back, but we know that when we get to the bottom of the mountain, get back to our car, we're going to be able to drive into a nearby town and get a big juicy steak dinner or something else that really appeals to us. All the way down the trail, heading back toward our car, once the blood sugar has dropped low enough in our body that we are really hungry, our emotional brain responds to that by not just making us feel hungry, but giving us images in our mind of the kind of food we would love to be eating right now, and the kind of food we hope to be eating in a couple of hours when we get down to the bottom of the trail and get into our car and drive to the restaurant. Our emotional brain matches our urge and our vision of what we desire, the object of our desire, in this case a delicious meal, and the urge is to drive to the restaurant and order that meal and eat it. The emotional brain matches that urge and that image of the object of our hunger desire to the drive, the hunger drive that needs to be satisfied. But if we've satisfied our hunger drive and we're not doing anything else, we're not out on a hike, we haven't satisfied our sex drive, and our sex drive wants to be satisfied, then our emotional brain will fill our mind with images of an object of sexual desire and an activity that we could perform with that object of sexual desire in order to satisfy our sex drive. And that's what was happening to me when I was 11 3/4 years old, when I was having spontaneous erections, almost all the time, and just having the urge to show my naked penis to a woman or women. And I was having images of women floating through my mind, images of women in sexy outfits, nearly naked, and images that were brought up from my memory banks, from Gina Lollobrigida as the Queen of Sheba in the movie Solomon and Sheba that my friend David and I watched the coming attractions of 3 times because they were so hot. Those images came back into my mind, and images from magazines, maybe television, other movies. I don't remember what exactly I was thinking about before I had my first orgasm. I don't recall, because I wasn't expecting to have an orgasm. I was 11 3/4 lying in my bed, hot summer night, I've taken off all my pajamas and I'm lying just under a sheet on my back in bed, and I didn't know that an orgasm was about to happen to me because I'd never heard of orgasms. I'd never heard of sex. I didn't know what sex was. I was completely ignorant about all these things because, my father was a minister and he was very sexually uptight, and so it wasn't discussed in our family at all. I thought that babies were made because an angel would put a baby in the mommy's belly and tummy, and it would grow there, and then she would give birth. That was the myth that I was told, and I believed it, But now, before I have my orgasm again, before I describe it to you again, I want to finish making my point. Why am I telling this sexual history? So that I think all of us, in order to be sexually relaxed and free of guilt, sexually innocent, when we become sexually aroused, and that's the prerequisite for super euphoric sex, is to be completely calm and relaxed and without any conflict when we become aroused. And we can become highly aroused without having to be really tense or excited or worked up or nervous or urgent. Calm arousal is what allows us to control the level of arousal that occurs in our consciousness so that we don't have too much arousal all at once and immediately trigger our orgasm reflex. And if we are very tense, if we have become armored, meaning that we have tension in throughout our organism, muscular tension, emotional tension, intellectual tension, throughout our organism, as a chronic thing, meaning all the time, chronic organismic tension, that is a barrier to sexual arousal. Anxiety and tension go together, and anxiety makes it harder to get emotionally aroused. And therefore, if we've got a chronic level of tension and anxiety in our organism, in order to get aroused, we have to, be really intense about our arousal and really focused on our arousal and make it happen and really strive to make it happen. And when it does happen, then it happens with a sudden burst that breaks into consciousness. All of a sudden, finally, the sexual arousal circuits of our emotional brain are able to break through the inhibition of anxiety and send out a surge of emotional arousal energy into our system. And it's all of a sudden as though a dam broke and a huge flood wave, tidal flood wave, surged down the river and destroying everything in its path, and then shazam, an orgasm happens immediately. That's what happens when we get aroused if we're really tense. And so that is one of the root causes of rapid ejaculation or premature ejaculation, is the fact that we have to break through organismic tension in order to get aroused. And then once the arousal breaks through, it just keeps on shooting on up until it hits the orgasm threshold immediately and triggers an orgasm reflex. So that's why it's important to be relaxed when we get sexually aroused, so that we can feel a burst of sexual arousal energy come into our consciousness, and we can relax and let that burst of energy fill our consciousness and float on out toward the borders of our consciousness and kind of dissipate off into the distance. And we try to open up and make our consciousness permeable at its limits so that energy can flow out of our consciousness in all directions. We're not trapping it in. What happens usually is if we have a tense consciousness and we're trapping in the energy, then the energy comes up and hits the border of consciousness, and there's not much room for it to expand into, so it bounces back down and triggers the orgasm reflex very rapidly. So what we want to do is dissolve that ceiling of tension, that globe of tension within the center of our consciousness, dissolve those tensions so that when the surge of sexual arousal energy comes up, it can keep on floating out in all directions. And one way we do that is by clearing our mind of thoughts, doing Zen mind clearing meditation at the moment, just stopping our thoughts, relaxing our eyes, relaxing all the muscles of our eyes so that our eye muscles don't form a band of tension, trapping the bliss expansion. Relax our eyes, clear our mind of thoughts, relax our body, don't put in any more pleasure input, and don't put any more emotional arousal input. Quit thinking about whatever is sexy about the situation. Stop thinking about that. Breathe gently. You can breathe out, sigh out. If there's a lot of energy, you can sigh out the energy and release some of the energy that way so that it doesn't trigger the orgasm reflex. And you allow the energy to flow out into consciousness and eventually dissipate, and then you can resume sexual activity. And the more you do this, the easier it is to allow greater and greater amounts of pre-orgasmic sexual bliss to fill consciousness before finally triggering an orgasm and having a full consciousness orgasm, the cosmic, oceanic orgasm that flows through our entire consciousness and feels like the whole universe, the whole cosmos is having an orgasm because our entire consciousness is participating in the waves of pleasure. And so I am trying to explain how my personal sexual history developed and my personal sexual preferences developed, because I think that even though I have some sexual preferences that are socially considered rather scandalous, that nevertheless I had no choice but to develop those particular sexual preferences because of the particular sexual experiences, the sexual stimuli that my emotional brain happened to be exposed to during those years of puberty, right, or when I first was learning to have orgasms. Those are the memories that form very strong sexual arousal stimuli for the future. And so I want to explain how I came to be completely relaxed about my supposedly unconventional sexual turn-ons, and how all of us, I think, should learn to view our own sexual turn-ons, whatever they happen to be, as the normal product of whatever experiences we happened to have around our years of puberty, whatever experiences happened to match up with the sexiness recognition centers that we happen to have in our own particular individual emotional brain. My emotional brain clearly has always been turned on by women, so it's evident that the sexiness recognition centers I happened to inherit in my emotional brain have a criterion of naked women are a sexy stimulus. And so I didn't get to see many naked women when I was growing up, but those few that I did get to see made a big impression on my emotional brain, and my emotional brain was like everybody's emotional brain. It's opportunistic. That is, whatever opportunities for getting turned on are available to us, those are the ones that our emotional brain is going to respond to. But now, if my emotional brain's sexiness recognition centers had been different, if I had happened to inherit a sexiness recognition center that found men's bodies and men's sexual organs sexually arousing, that the built-in criteria for sexual arousal in my emotional brain referred to men's bodies instead of women's bodies, then I wouldn't have gotten turned on by Gina Lollobrigida in the movies. I would have gotten turned on by Steve Reeves being Hercules and, running around in nothing but, or Tarzan running around in just a loincloth. But I didn't get turned on by Steve Reeves or Tarzan. I got turned on by Gina Lollobrigida, the Queen of Sheba, and the women that were running around in the Hercules movies, and Jane, Tarzan's mate. So my emotional brain was taking whatever opportunities were presented to it that matched its innate criteria. So both of those things have to match: our sexiness recognition centers and the form of stimulation that we're getting from the outside. Okay, so I don't remember what woman I was thinking about or what exactly I was doing in my mind as I lay in my bed, 11 3/4 years old, summer of 1960, hot summer night, nothing but the sheet over my body. I know that I was having exhibitionistic fantasies at that time, because one of my favorite things to do my emotional brain was just giving me this urge to stand naked in front of a full-length mirror in my bedroom when nobody else was in the house, and get out this Zorro mask, that my mom had made as a Halloween costume a few years earlier. Just a black strip of cloth like that with 2 eye holes in it, and made of just very flexible, soft cloth. And so my emotional brain was giving me the urge to thrust my penis through one of the eye holes of the Zorro mask, and I was standing in front of the mirror imagining that there were women out there looking at me that I was showing my penis to, kind of like the same thing when I was in the bathtub with my mother when I was 3.5 years old and I wanted to show her my penis then. My emotional brain has an innate urge for exhibitionism. And so I would stand in front of the mirror and put, and my erect penis would just sticking straight out in front of me, and I would slip the Zorro mask, the eye hole, right over my penis and pull it right up as far as it would go till it was snug up against my balls, and then just let it hang there, and just stand there naked with the Zorro mask hanging from my erect penis, imagining I was showing this to some women who were appreciating it. So it's possible that when I had my first orgasm, I didn't know that it was possible to have an orgasm. So I wasn't trying to have an orgasm. And so I wasn't actively rubbing my penis against anything to give myself enough pleasure to make an orgasm occur, because I didn't know it was possible to do that yet. But I was lying there under the sheet was on top of my penis, and it may be that as I lay there in the dark, and my brother's asleep in the bed, on the other side of the room there next to me, he's asleep, and I'm just lying there in the dark, fantasizing probably about maybe dancing naked for a group of women, and I'm moving my body under the sheet, moving my pelvis around to show these women my penis, and just that very slight movement of my erect penis, particularly the front of it, which is the most sensitive side when it's erect and it's lying up on my tummy, then the side of my penis that's facing up, that's the most sensitive area right there just below the head of the penis. And that area was just, rubbing gently against the sheet. And since I had never had an orgasm, my testes had been producing sperm cells, and my prostate gland was producing semen, the fluid that the sperm cells ride in, and that was all filling up the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles It was like all the reservoirs holding sperm and semen were filled up because my body had been producing this, and I wasn't letting it out. So it was kind of like having a full bladder. It doesn't take much to get you to start peeing. Well, I don't know, I had, a full seminal vesicle, full prostate gland, and just that slight rubbing of my penis on the sheet, triggered that orgasm, that all of a sudden I felt the muscles at the base of my penis contracting, and at the same time, each time those muscles would contract in my penis, there would be this lightning bolt of pleasure that shot straight up through the center of my consciousness, like, just like a pillar of fire, a pillar of pleasure just rising up through consciousness, time and time again, with each contraction of my penis, until it finally stopped. And I had no idea what had happened. What was that? All I knew was it was great. It was the best thing I'd ever experienced. It was a lot better than going to Disneyland or anything else you could imagine. An orgasm, wow. But I didn't know it was called an orgasm. I didn't know what it was. And I thought, because I didn't hear anyone else talking about having this kind of an experience, I'd never heard anyone talking about it, and I started, listening and paying attention after that, and nobody else was talking about anything like that. 1960, there was sort of a society-wide ban on sexual talk of any sort. You wouldn't hear it in the movies. You'd never hear anybody talk about orgasm or having sex. You'd never see people in bed having sex the way that happened, after 1960s, mid-1960s, late 1960s with the sexual revolution. You started seeing people in bed, even whether they were under the covers or not. But in any case, you saw nothing like that before 1960, not even suggested, at least not in any movie I ever saw, and no adult that I ever heard talk about anything about sex. I never heard any adult talk about anything related to sex. And my friends would talk about something called the facts of life, but I didn't know what that was. And they talked about it like it was something really icky. So I wasn't eager to find out what the facts of life was. I figured there was something unpleasant out there that sooner or later I was probably going to have to know about, but I was not eager to find out about it or anything. And it certainly, in no way did I think it was connected with the orgasm that I had had. And so I began to think that I had invented orgasms, that I was really the first to discover this in human history. And I felt an obligation, really, to inform the rest of the human race about what they were missing out on, because this was so great. I couldn't understand, why everybody else wouldn't be wanting to do this all the time if they knew about it. So I was prepared to tell the world, if you rub your penis when it's erect like that, you can have this really fantastic experience. And of course, the first people I was going to tell probably were my friends John and Ken. But, because I wanted them to be able to have as much fun as I was having. But I never did, I sort of just sensed, well, if nobody's talking about this, well, maybe I shouldn't either. I wasn't a pioneer of pleasurology in those days. I wasn't any kind of a radical person wanting to change the world. If people didn't already know about orgasms, it was a shame, but I don't know, I didn't feel like it was my place to inform the rest of the world about them. So I just concentrated on enjoying my own orgasms, which I was doing because I figured, there was a way to repeat this experience, and I figured out soon that it was like just rubbing my penis up against that sheet a little more deliberately, and that would do it, particularly if I thought about Gina Lollobrigida and her belly dancing costume in the fertility dance. That would, give me an orgasm pretty fast. And I had no guilt about it at all. I was just enjoying this so much that every night, right after dinner, I started saying, "Can I go to bed now?" Because I was so naive, I didn't realize my parents would obviously catch on. Stevie usually wants to stay up late rather than have to go to bed. All of a sudden now he wants to go to bed. What's up with that? He's wanting to go to bed right after dinner. It's like 6:30 in the evening and he wants to go to bed. But they didn't say anything to me about it. So I continued to enjoy my orgasms, the thing I looked forward to every day, and then in the morning. And pretty soon I figured that I could get more of a pleasurable feeling if I turned over, instead of lying on my back, just getting rubbing my penis against the sheet up above. If I turned over and rubbed my erection on the mattress below me, on the sheet and the mattress below me, that was even more pleasurable. And once I started doing that, my emotional brain, again, doing the primary process of translating a need state into a mental picture of what will satisfy the need state, I got the idea of rubbing my penis on Gina Lollobrigida's tummy, because somehow that was the sexiest part of her body to me. And I just thought, wow, rubbing my naked penis on her naked belly, because the key feature of her fertility dance costume, besides the brassiere that looked like it was only made out of an outline and that you could see everything of her breasts except her nipples, that was the top half of the sexiness. But the lower half of the sexiness was the way that her belly dancing costume dived down towards her pubic area, and only the pubic area was covered by some kind of little circular thing. And the rest of her tummy, from her belly button right down to the top of her pubic mound, was all naked. And, nowadays, you see that in every, bikini bathing suit. But in those days, bathing suits were pretty much cut straight across. They were cut straight across. They didn't dive down like that, exposing the whole front of the woman's tummy there. So that was very sexy and very exciting to my emotional brain. So my emotional brain said, yeah, just imagine that you're rubbing your penis on Gina Lollobrigida's naked belly there, and that would give me an orgasm very quickly. But then, at some point, and it wasn't very long, I'd been seeing my mother around the house naked for years. We would be going to the beach. We'd come home from the beach. She'd make sure we got in the shower. She'd pull down our swimsuits and put us in the shower. And then she'd take off her swimsuit and she'd get in the shower right after we got out. She might dry us off there too. So there was plenty of nakedness there. But I hadn't really been paying attention to it in the same way that I started to now. And because I began to get the idea, well, if it would be really fun to rub my penis on Gina Lollobrigida's tummy, naked tummy in her fertility dance costume, what if my mommy was completely naked and I was lying on top of her and rubbing my penis against her naked tummy, and her pubic mound, her beautiful triangle of golden brown pubic hair, which was the only pubic area that I had ever seen, either in photographs or in real life. Well, and it was in real life. So once I had that idea, my emotional brain said, yeah, that's a good idea. And I had the urge to do that. So I lay in bed face down, naked, rubbing my penis on the mattress and thinking about rubbing my penis on my mommy's naked tummy and her pubic mound, her pubic curls. And that was really exciting. And so that became my preferred masturbation fantasy every night. And I had the idea that I wanted to go to my mother and say to her, "Mommy, let's rub." That's all I wanted to say to her was, "Mommy, let's rub." Now I think that would make an interesting T-shirt to wear on. "Mommy, let's rub." It would scandalize some people, I suppose. And I really fantasized. I really, wanted to do that, and I never, I'm very shy, and I never actually worked up the courage to do that. But I certainly imagined it, because her bedroom, her and my dad's bedroom, was right next door to where I was. And I could imagine going in there and talking to her, say, "Mommy, let's rub." And she'd say, "Okay, fine, let's do it." And she would take off her clothes and lie down on the bed, and I would take off my clothes and lie down on top of her and rub my penis on her tummy until I came. But I obviously never did that. Now, interestingly, during this period, my father had moved out of town temporarily. He had gone to take a temporary church pastorage. That is, he became the pastor of a church while they were supposedly looking for another full-time permanent pastor. He took it in the meantime. They called it an interim pastorate. And so the church where he had gone to do this was about 4 hours away. It was on the other side of Los Angeles. We were out on the coast. You had to drive about an hour and a half to get to Los Angeles, and then you had to drive another couple hours. Well, you had to drive, an hour to get through Los Angeles, and then another couple hours beyond it to get to the church. It was out in the desert where my dad was preaching all week. So he was gone all week, or he was certainly gone on the weekends because he had to be there Sunday to preach at the church. And he would sometimes come home for a couple of days, but then he'd go back down there. But so he was gone, a lot of the time. And what happened, I think, and I've reconstructed this, was that my mother did my laundry. She washed my sheets on the bed. And so I'm sure that she noticed what I never even thought about her noticing, was all the semen stains on my sheets and on the mattress cover below the sheet. When she would take off the sheet, there would be all these yellow stains from my ejaculations. And so, she knew something was going on, and she had seen my penis erect, at the lunch table a year or so earlier, year and a half earlier maybe, when I was thinking about Gina Lollobrigida and got that erection in my jeans, and she had to pull down my jeans and discovered that, I had an erection there. So she knew that I was approaching puberty, and she could see from my sheets that I was. And she didn't say anything to me about it. She didn't encourage me in it, at least not in words. She didn't encourage me. And she didn't shame me, although she was a Christian like my father, but she was more of a liberal Christian, and she felt that the Christians were basically wrong in their attitude toward sexuality, and I think particularly in their attitude toward masturbation. She had been masturbating, I'm sure, since she was a teenager, and found that she could turn guys on with her well-developed young body at the beach or elsewhere, and wearing cute clothes and stuff. And she was able to be somewhat of a domestic exhibitionist at home, because she had 3 brothers, and she had one brother in particular, her older brother, who was a sensitive intellectual type. And apparently my mother's emotional brain was drawn to, intelligent, intellectual, gentle men. And so She had a quasi-dating relationship with her oldest brother. He must have been maybe 5 years older than she, I don't know. Anyway, when she was a young teenager, he was maybe just graduating from high school or something. And they used to go to the movies together and take the bus together and walk home together. And I rather suspect that she also enjoyed letting him have a glimpse of her around the house, in her bra and panties, which this would have been back in the 1930s. So that would be quite a sexually arousing stimulus for anyone. Later on, she made a comment to me that she felt she had perhaps ruined her older brother and felt guilty about it, that by being so sexy with him, encouraging him then to masturbate thinking about her, and he was always quite shy and introverted anyway, and he never did marry, and she felt that maybe she had made him too sexually guilty by giving her such sexual stimulation around the house. Other people said, well, no, Gunner's he's just homosexual, And I think it was kind of a combination of the two. One time, much, much later, many years later, when I was already in my mid-30s, or later, I don't know, I was over at my mother's house one day. She was not there. And I picked up the phone. The phone rang, and I picked it up. And it was Uncle Gunner. And so it was a surprise to both of us that I was on the end of the phone instead of my mother. And I could tell, because I was already doing a lot of phone sex myself by that time, and I could tell that Gunner was having phone sex on his end of the phone, and that he'd, called up my mom and was going to be having phone sex with her, except that I was there instead. But that didn't slow him down at all. He was just as happy to be having phone sex talking to me as to her. So I suspect that, his emotional brain was capable of being sexually aroused by interacting sexually with someone of either sex. But anyway, my mom also did this later on with my father. He told me, she used to walk around in the house in this sexy lingerie that would just drive me crazy. And it would drive him crazy because they weren't having sex. Their sexual relationship broke down, basically on their honeymoon night when he couldn't get it up. And she only had sex with him twice after that, once for myself and once for my brother. And she had said she had to work pretty hard to make that happen. And otherwise, she wasn't trying to have sex with him. She'd given up on him. And so when she was walking around the house in these sexy lingerie outfits, she was enjoying turning him on and enjoying knowing that he would eventually, go in the bathroom and masturbate and think about her. And that would make him sexually guilty because he's a minister and he's not supposed to be doing that, but he's been masturbating since he was young anyway, and he had a masturbation habit that he was always trying to kick, and that gave him an ulcer, a duodenal ulcer in his stomach. And that he, because he was hiding this from the world for years, that he was a secret masturbator. And she wasn't helping that by, walking around the house showing him female beauty, sexy female beauty that he couldn't get anywhere else. His other, his hottest sexual stimulation was the sexy covers of Perry Mason mystery magazines, paperbacks, actually little novels, as I told you before. And ultimately, what happened to him at some point in the 1950s, when we had moved to the house that was only one block from UCLA, he had been a student at UCLA for 1 year. After he graduated from Hollywood High School, he went to UCLA, which, just a little bit further in Westwood. And he had a great year. His freshman year at UCLA, he found some fun kids to hang out with that were not so buttoned down as the young people at Hollywood First Presbyterian Church youth group had been. And he and his friends, boys and girls, young men and young women, would go down to the beach, because UCLA was just 20 minutes drive from Santa Monica Beach. And so they would cut classes and go spend the day at the beach, because nobody was catching them. Nobody was paying attention to them. And they had some good times there. And my dad was starting to get sexually liberated. There's one picture of him standing on Santa Monica Beach between two cute young women of his own age that he's got his arms around, and they're all three in swimsuits, and these are cute girls. And so one of his other buddies is taking a picture, and my dad was wearing a pair of swim trunks that were square cut, like boxer swim trunks. However, they were form-fitting. They were not loose. They molded themselves to the shape of his body. And in this picture, you can clearly see his penis standing up. He's got a partial erection while he's standing there between these two women. And so he was starting to get sexually liberated a little bit more there at UCLA. In fact, he must have been doing this kinky thing that he later got arrested for when we were living there. 15 years later, we moved back and we're living there. He went over to the library, and I think he must have been doing this during his freshman year. He got caught in the UCLA library sitting at a table, a study table, across from a cute co-ed, okay? And by this time, my dad is in his mid to late 30s, and as a minister, I don't know, he might have been wearing a suit and tie, who knows what. And he's sitting across from this cute co-ed, and he's pretending to read a book, and she's reading a book across the way. But actually down between his legs, he has a little pocket mirror, a tiny little pocket mirror in his hand, and he's holding it between his legs and looking down at it. The reflection bounces across, and he's got it aimed so that he can look at the girl's skirt across the way and hope to catch a glimpse up the girl's skirt under the table with his pocket mirror. And, this was, this is what men were driven to. These are the extremes men were driven to before there was internet porn and before there were even, magazines that were easily available. And when he as a minister, would have a hard time buying a sexy girly magazine, so he would probably be too embarrassed to actually do that. So he reverted to what he was doing his freshman year at UCLA. I'm sure this was something, one of his buddies taught him how to do. And, they had fun doing this, trying to look up girls' skirts by looking down at this pocket mirror in their lap. Well, that's one thing to do that when you're, going to UCLA yourself, when you're a young college guy and you fit right in. But now if you're like a man in his 30s, possibly in a suit, and you're sitting there, people may, wonder what's going on with you, and somebody, with a sharp eye figured out what he was doing. And they called the police and actually arrested him in the UCLA library for looking up girls' skirts with a pocket mirror. And for a minister, a Presbyterian minister, in the 1950s, the mid-50s, this was a disaster. This was a career breaker. It wasn't like the Catholic Church, where they would just send him on to a different parish, The Presbyterians there were a lot stricter than that. They weren't going to give this guy a parish anymore. They weren't going to let him work in a church anymore if he'd been doing perverted stuff like that. So I think that really caused a career change for him, and that's when he started doing more overseas missions. He would go to places like India and try and convert people over there, kind of to expiate his sin, because he'd been caught and punished, and now he was punishing himself to try and work off the sin by going to really unpleasant places and trying to convert the natives over there. But anyway, he'd probably been doing that as a freshman in college. And apparently his freshman year in college, when he went to the spring prom, he bought a real nice flannel suit, cream-colored suit. He was a little bit of a sharp dresser, and so this nice cream-colored suit and probably what you call saddle shoes, with, two-tone shoes, and go to the dance and do a lot of swing dancing, and then do the slow dances, which is just like hugging to music, as he used to tell me. And then afterwards, of course, go out to his car and neck there for a long time. And so that night, the necking must have gotten heavy enough that he ejaculated into his pants. He was making some progress sexually in his life. But then, a couple days later, his father calls him into the laundry room. And my grandmother, my father's mother, had died about a year before that of cancer, just about the time my father graduated from high school. And that was kind of what sent him into sort of an existential search about what is the meaning of life? How could God let my mother, this devout woman, die of cancer? Maybe there isn't a God. And so that's when he kind of went into this rebellious period in his freshman year, where he started to get a little bit sexually liberated and have fun at the beach and have fun petting with his girlfriend after the prom. But his father now, because his mother's dead, his father's now the one who is doing the laundry. And so he calls my dad into the laundry room, and he just holds out my dad's pants with this semen stain in the lap of the pants of this cream-colored suit, so that it shows up really well because the suit is cream-colored. And he just looks at my dad, and he shakes his head, and he starts crying. My grandfather starts crying. So my dad is just totally crushed by seeing his father in tears because he's been out petting with a girl and had an ejaculation in his pants. Now, in Polynesia, they would be saying, "Good for you, Bill." In fact, in Polynesia, they would have been encouraging him to do much more than that. But in America, in a conservative Presbyterian church environment, and my grandfather was very pious, very sincere Christian, this was just a tragedy that his son had been doing something so sexy after the prom with his girlfriend that he actually came in his pants. This was something to show to the son and say, how could you do this to me, basically? How could you make me so ashamed of you that you've done this? Whereas a Polynesian father would say, right on, have a good time, glad to see that. So we see that sexual activity can be either reinforced, encouraged, or discouraged, punished, socially by other people. So there are two kinds of reinforcement or punishment. that can occur with sexuality. There's innate pleasure or unpleasure, and usually sexual activity is innately pleasurable. So sexual behavior is going to be naturally pleasurable, innately pleasurable. And that's the way natural selection has designed it, because natural selection wants to reward us for activity that is eventually going to lead to making babies. That reproductive activity of any sort has got to be rewarding to us so that we will continue to perpetuate this species. And that's one of our strongest emotional drives. So sexuality is innately very, very rewarding. You know, if when we had an orgasm, if it was painful to have an orgasm, we wouldn't want to do it again. And so we wouldn't reproduce. We would avoid sexual activity, and we wouldn't have children and pass our genes on. And so our genes would drop out of the gene pool because we found orgasm painful rather than pleasurable. But that's not the way that natural selection has designed it. Natural selection has operated in such a way that only people who find orgasm pleasurable pass on their genes. Except for, like women who can pass on their genes without having an orgasm at all, as long as they allow their husbands to have sex with them. But for all species, basically, for all species, sexual activity is innately pleasurable. But then the social environment can either reinforce that pleasure by encouraging the person for being sexual and praising them for being sexual, or the social environment can oppose that innately pleasurable aspect of sexual activity by condemning sexual activity and saying, oh, you're a bad person, you're a morally bad person for enjoying sexual activity. That's a sinful thing to do. The imaginary spirit being God doesn't like it. The absolutely unknowable doesn't like for you to be sexual. Whereas, since the absolutely unknowable is absolutely unknowable, it's just as likely that the absolutely unknowable is more like the Polynesians and enjoys it. When we have a pleasurable state of consciousness, a euphoric experience with orgasm, I would think that the absolutely unknowable, would prefer us, would like us to have as much sexual pleasure as possible, as long as we can do it safely and intelligently and carefully, and not getting pregnant unless we really want to, and not catching STDs, and not causing anybody heartbreak. But if we can avoid those things, then the more sexual euphoria we can give ourselves, I think the more the absolutely unknowable would approve of that. But then, because the absolutely unknowable is unknowable, I can't know that. I can only guess that. It only makes sense to me. But that's what I prefer to believe, because there's no reason to believe, first, that anything absolutely unknowable exists at all, and secondly, there's no reason to believe that if it does exist, that it doesn't want us to enjoy sexuality. There's no reason to believe that at all. That's just what some human beings have imagined in the past, because people all have their own versions of the absolutely unknowable. So in Polynesia, let's say, where young people are being sexual, in fact, they were, encouraged to go out and explore relationships with other people when they were teenagers and have sexual experiences and enjoy them as much as possible during that period of life that the Polynesians called the Tau Reka Reka, meaning Tau, meaning period of life, Reka, meaning pleasure, Reka Reka, meaning as much pleasure as you can have. The period of life when you're meant to be just enjoying yourself as much as possible, and especially enjoying your sexuality. So in that case, in that kind of a social environment where the parents are encouraging of the children, where, the parents will select the young person's first sexual partner, a more experienced sexual partner that they know will give the young person a very pleasurable first sexual experience. So that will encourage the young person to have sexual confidence and to go on to have other sexual relationships. Instead of that, where society encourages the natural pleasure of sexuality, in a Christian society like the Hollywood Presbyterian Church in the 1930s and 40s, that particular society, that particular culture, opposes the innate pleasure of sexuality and makes a person feel like they're a morally bad person for enjoying the pleasure of sexuality. But the pleasure of sexuality is not to be enjoyed, is not to be experienced until you're married to one person and you stay with that person for the rest of your life. But otherwise, it's a sin to do that. And so when my grandfather sees my father's cream-colored flannel pants with the semen stain in them, to him, this is like a tragedy that his son has broken the rules of the church and has engaged in a kind of activity which is shameful and sinful and bad. And so I think that was one of the deciding factors that made my grandfather decide to send my father off to work on a farm for the summer. The other factor was the fact that his grade point average was around D, not A, B, or C, but D. He had had a bad year because he'd been going to the beach and having too good a time with all his friends. And so my grandfather said to himself, my son has just had it too easy in life. We've been well-to-do. He's worked a little bit at the department stores that the family owns, but he hasn't really had to get out and work hard, and he needs to be punished because he's gotten D's as his grade point average, and B, there's that semen stain on his flannel. He's going down the road to perdition. We need to shape this guy up. So my grandfather has a sister who owns a ranch, owns a farm up in the area that is now Silicon Valley in San Jose. And so my father has to go up there for the summer to work on the farm and learn what hard work is, and that he shouldn't just fritter away his opportunity at college to get a good college degree and prepare himself to, earn a decent living. And that summer on the farm changed the direction of my father's life. And I'm sure I wouldn't be here if it hadn't happened, because one morning, early in the morning, my father gets up, and he's not really wide awake, but he goes down, he's got to get started on the day. Who knows, maybe he's been masturbating up in bed, and he feels kind of guilty for having done it, and so his head is full of guilt and other thoughts. He's not focused on what he's doing, okay? He goes down to the barn, and there's the tractor there that he has to use to go out and till the fields with. Drive the tractor over the fields, and it'll churn up the soil and make it ready to be planted. So he goes down there to the tractor, and it was an old tractor. You didn't start the tractor by putting the key in the ignition and turning the ignition on. You had to start the tractor like you would an old-fashioned car by going around to the front of the tractor where there's a crank. You put a crank in the front of the tractor at a certain thing, and you turn that crank a few times until you get the engine to turn over, and then the engine catches and starts running. So my father's, not fully awake probably, and still feeling guilty about having masturbated, because he knows it's a sin in the eyes of God. So he's down there and he's cranking away, and the tractor engine starts up, and the tractor leaps forward. And my father is standing in front of the tractor. The tractor leaps forward, and it pins my father against the wall of the barn. And the wheels are turning, and the tractor is trying to go forward, and my father is pinned against the wall by the front of the tractor against the wall of the barn, and he's yelling bloody murder for help. And the other guy that's helping out, the other laborer who's helping out on the farm that summer, a young black man, or I don't know how old he was, but he comes in, he's the regular farm guy. And what had happened was that whoever put the tractor away the night before, and it could have been my father, had made a mistake when he stopped the tractor. Instead of putting it in neutral, he left it in gear. He left it in first gear. And that's why, you see, if the tractor had been in neutral gear and my dad had cranked up the engine, the engine would have started, but it wouldn't have turned the wheels because it wasn't in gear, it was in neutral. But because the gear shift was put into first gear, when the engine started up, the gears were engaged, and that started the wheels turning, and so the tractor started inexorably pushing my dad against the wall. And he thought he was going to die. And the guy managed to, the farm worker, leaped up into the tractor and turned it off, and then pulled the tractor back and got my dad out of there and took him in the house. And he was in the hospital for weeks after that. And he thought he was going to die right then and there. And that was the thing that caused him a few months later to be wondering what he should do with his life. He'd messed up his first year at UCLA. He wasn't even going to go back there. He wasn't ready to go back to school in the fall. He wasn't well enough. He didn't know what he was going to do. And so to get some counseling and clear guidance about this, he went to see the woman who ran the Christian education department at Hollywood Presbyterian Church, a woman named Miss Myers. And her thing was persuading every young man she possibly could to go into the ministry. And there was a saying going around, don't let Miss Mears get you down on your knees in her study praying to the Lord, because, you'll end up committing your life to going into the ministry. And that's exactly what happened to my father. She got him down. Let's let the Lord tell you what to do, Bill. And so Bill imagined that the Lord was telling him to go into the ministry, because otherwise, he'd been saved from death. There must be a reason why he'd been saved that way. So he ended up going into the ministry, and also, just to show you how tragically different social values were in those days. And that would have been, 1939, maybe, 1938, 39. When my dad got out of the hospital and he was at home recuperating, the black farmhand from the farm on San Jose, who had saved my father's life, wanted to come down and see him and see how he was doing. And so he went all the way down to Hollywood, which is, it's a long journey. I don't know whether he lived in San Jose or what, but he came to Hollywood specifically to come and see my father at my grandfather's big, fancy house, just not far north of Hollywood Boulevard in the foothills there, next to little park and everything, real fancy, big, ritzy house. And so this ordinary black guy who works on a farm, comes up to the front door wanting to see Bill. And my grandfather opens it and opens the door and looks at him, and says, what do you want? And so he had my father come down and talk to him on the doorstep. My grandfather would not let that man into the house simply because he was a black man. That's how prejudiced and how backward the man who had saved my father's life would not let him into the fucking house. Unbelievable. And so my father went into the ministry, and my mother, after she had her abortion, saw my father, the young minister who was about to graduate from seminary, and she was feeling all sinful because she'd had an abortion, and she felt guilty about that, and so she thinks she'll redeem her life by marrying a minister, just the way my father thought he'd redeem his life of dissipation on the beach with his UCLA buddies by going into the ministry, and so they meet at a Christian conference ground, and 4 years later they're married, and they have me. But anyway, you can see that's my father's background, and next time I'll tell you how that played in to my own masturbation history, and the fact that even though masturbation was intensely rewarding for me, and I felt no guilt about it at all, and I would have gone on masturbating without guilt for the rest of my life, I suppose, if nobody had ever said anything to me about it. But, of course, that's not the kind of society I was growing up in 1960, with a minister who was still struggling with his own masturbation issues, and who still believed firmly that masturbation was a sin and something that God did not want us to be doing. Okay, I'll talk about that more next time. Thanks for listening.